In chapter 15, the focal point is allocation of costs. And one of the primary types of allocation of costs is when you have support departments that you want to allocate their costs to the revenue generating or operating department. So you've got support departments, which are typically cost centers. They only incur costs. And then you have operating departments, which are typically profit centers. They generate revenue as well as costs. And so many companies will allocate the support department costs to the operating departments to get a better feel for the profitability of the operating departments. One of the first things that you have to do in order to do that is identify what the most appropriate allocation base is. And as we've talked about repeatedly over the quad, the allocation base you want to use is what best reflects cause and effect. So in this example, which is actually in your textbook, it's 15-21, we have four departments: human resources and information systems, which are both support department. And then we have operating departments, corporate sales and consumer sales. And I've given you the costs that they've incurred in each department. Then, in terms of allocation, we've determined that it makes sense to allocate human resources based on the number of employees that are in each department. That would make sense. Human resources has to provide more services the more employees are in a particular department. And then information systems, we're going to allocate based on the time information systems spends processing jobs for them, which again, there's a cause and effect relationship there. So there's three approaches that I want to walk through. The first one is probably the most straightforward. It's called the direct method. And what it does is it says we're going to take human resources and information systems each and allocate them to the corporate and consumer departments and completely ignore the fact that they may actually provide services for each other. So information systems has employees and human resources requires information systems time, but we're ignoring that. We're going to take the total costs for HR and for information system and just allocate them directly to the operating departments. And so what I have done here, you can see the $72,700 coming out of HR because it's going to go into our operating departments. And then my formula for that is to take the $72,700, multiply it by the corporate number of employees divided by the sum of corporate and consumer. Notice in this case, I'm ignoring the 21 employees in information systems because we're not going to allocate anything to information systems. Then for consumer, I've done the same thing, taken the $72,700, multiply it by the 28 consumer employees divided by the total. And I have a check figure over here that is the sum of the row so that I can verify and confirm that I did indeed allocate the whole thing. Then I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the $234,400 in information systems. I'm going to take the number of hours that were spent processing for corporate, divide it by the sum of the hours for corporate and consumer, and that's how much I'll allocate to corporate. Again, notice I'm ignoring the 320 hours that were spent on HR because we're not going to allocate anything to HR. Then in the consumer department, I've done exactly the same thing. The only difference is my numerator is the 1,600 hours from the consumer department. And again, I have a check figure to confirm that I did allocate the full $234,400. Okay, the next method is called the step-down method. And this method, we do assume and recognize that the support departments do work for each other. It's called the step-down method, though, because we pick one of those departments to allocate to the other support department, and then we allocate the next support department to the operating. How we choose which one we allocate first is a management decision. It can be based on who has the greatest amount of costs, who uses the greatest amount of service. That's a management call. I am going to walk through two examples here, one where we allocate HR first and one where we allocate information systems first. So where in the first one, we allocate HR first, we're going to take the $72,700, take it out of HR, but notice in this case, we're going to allocate it not just to corporate and consumer like we did in the previous one, but we're actually going to allocate some of it to information systems based on the 21 hours that they use, which means our denominator will indeed be the full 91 employees. Okay, and that results in 16,777 being allocated to information systems. Then we'll do the same thing in corporate, same formula. Denominator is 91, but in this case, the numerator is 42. And we wind up with 33,554 being allocated to corporate. And then consumer, same thing, numerator is 28. And we wind up with 22,369 allocated to consumer. Now we're going to allocate information systems to corporate and consumer, but notice the amount we're going to allocate now includes that 16,777 that was allocated to information systems from HR. So when we do our formula, which will be the same formula we did above, wherein the numerator is corporate or consumer, and the denominator is the sum of the two. We're ignoring HR. The only difference between this and the direct method is that the amount we'll be allocating is going to be $251,177. The $234,400 incurred in information systems plus the 16,777 that was allocated to them. You'll notice we still, just like under the direct method, we allocate the full $1,795,230, or the full amount winds up in the operating departments. But if you look at each total, it's a little bit different. Not significantly, but a little bit different. Now, the second scenario here is I've just switched it where and said, okay, now we're going to allocate information systems first. And so we will allocate that to HR, corporate, and consumer. So our formula will include as a denominator the full 3,840 hours of time that the information systems spent. For HR, you'll notice the numerator is the 320 hours that was spent on HR. And then corporate, same formula, but the numerator is the 1920. And consumer, same formula, but the numerator is 1,600. Then, again, when we allocate HR, we will allocate it only to corporate and consumer. However, it now includes the $19,533 that was allocated to HR from IS, Information Systems. And so corporate will have as its formula corporate employees as the numerator. The denominator will only be the corporate and consumer employees in total. It will not include the information systems. And same thing for consumer. The numerator will be the 28 employees for consumer, and the denominator is the sum of those two. And again, we've got a grand total of $1,795,230, but the allocation between the two operating departments is a little different. Okay, the last approach I'm going to walk us through fairly quickly. It's called the reciprocal approach, and this is an approach wherein we acknowledge the fact that HR and IS do work for each other. And so we allocate back and forth between them. This is a little more complicated and requires the use of simultaneous equations, if you think back to your algebra. And so what I've done here is I've identified the fact that HR costs at any point in time, in this case, would be the $72,700 plus their share of information systems, their proportionate share, 320 over 3840. By the same token, information systems is going to be 234,400 plus 2191, or their share of the HR costs. So we have two equations with two variables, which means we have to solve a simultaneous equation, which basically means what I did was I took the HR equation and I substituted this equation, the one in A78, for the IS in HR. So I have HR equals 72,700 plus 320 divided by 3,840 times the equation for information systems. Now I only have one variable and I can solve for HR and I get 94,109. That becomes the amount of costs that HR has incurred, inclusive of the costs they got from information systems. And so information systems, we're assuming, is going to be allocating to HR 21,409, which is basically the difference between those, the 94,109 and 72,700. Then we pretty much, the 21,717, 43,435, 28,957, all of that is the same calculation we've used before, which is the number of employees in IS divided by the grand total. And then we will do the same thing here with allocating the 256,117. You'll notice I have a slight rounding error. Just ignore that for right now. We're not going to work really at length on this approach unless you have a really material difference in how costs are used. The reciprocal method is not going to be used by a company, but I want to throw it out there because technically it's the most accurate. It's just a question of whether or not it is considered cost beneficial.